Welcome. Thank you for joining us for our webinar, Finally, an approach to SAP and ArcGIS integration that delivers value. My name is Lindsay, and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar. Before we get started, I would like to mention a few housekeeping items. First, you can ask questions at any time throughout the presentation using the Q&A feature on the right-hand side of the screen. We will try to answer as many questions throughout the webinar, and we'll also leave some time at the end for Q&A. If we do not get to all the questions, we'll follow up with you after the presentation. Secondly, there will be 3 polling questions during today's webinar, which can be accessed through the polling feature. Once the poll is opened, we will give everyone about a minute to submit their responses. Great, now that we've covered the housekeeping items, I'd like to introduce you to today's presenters. First, we have Skip Heiss, the president of Geonexus Technologies. We also have Joe Brenton from Critigen, who works as their GIS and EAM integration lead. Skip and Joe have a combined 50 years of experience with GIS integration, and we're happy to have them both here with us today to share some of their unique insights and best practices for GIS and SAP integration. Thank you both so much for joining us. So on today's webinar, we'll focus on 3 topics. First, we'll discuss achieving value through ArcGIS and SAP integration. Next, Skip and Joe will talk about an approach and some key considerations for integrating SAP and ArcGIS. Finally, we'll talk about a unique solution for SAP and ArcGIS integration that leverages Critigen's Sage and the Geonexus integration platform. And then we'll wrap up with some time for questions at the end. So with that, let's kick things off with our first polling question. So the first question is, what's driving your interest in integrating ArcGIS and SAP? Please take a moment to enter your response. All right, great. Thank you so much. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass things off to Joe to get us started.
Thanks. Good morning. Just want to make sure you all can hear me okay.
Yep, we can hear you.
Thanks. So I'm happy to be here on behalf of Critigen and with our partner Geonexus, and I'm hoping we'll have some good discussions today. So please feel free to enter your questions into the Q&A. So to start with, Skip and I are going to talk a little bit about the benefits and the value of synchronization and integration and what you can do with that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some examples around situational awareness and better decision making, a little bit about analytics and reporting, and then I'm going to hand it off to Skip to talk about data integrity and how synchronization can actually help your data integrity. So Skip, if you want to go to the next slide. I'm going to start with what I call it's a simple example, but I think it's a scenario that many of you are challenged with. This is a web app that we built, a web map, an Esri web map that we built for the city of San Diego. And it was very specifically purpose-built for a very specific challenge. And the challenge is that the location of all of their fire hydrants is in Esri, in their GIS, but the status about whether or not that hydrant is working is stored in SAP. And so it was difficult for the firefighters in the rig traveling to a fire to understand what the status of fire hydrants was. So we built this purpose-built application, and the client already had synchronization in place. So we were able to display both the location and the status of the hydrants on the map. And if you think about how we've talked about expanding this with a client, and if you think about it, you have access to the SAP status, but you also have access to whether or not there's emergency work orders scheduled for these hydrants. You have the access to the pressure that was pulled from that hydrant during the last inspection. So again, this is a little bit of a simple example, but it's a really good example of how integration or connecting Esri and SAP together allows you to provide very specific products for your enterprise to help with decision making, and in this case for emergency response. I'll also point out that this was one of the first proof of concepts we did where we actually are storing all of this data in Esri's geodatabase inside SAP HANA. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but you'll start to see this common theme of integration plus Esri tools plus the geodatabase on HANA being this kind of common pattern or platform that Skip and I will talk about today. So Skip, let's go to the next slide. And another area where Esri SAP integration really shines is around analytics reporting. And it can add a lot of value by helping your business answer questions that you haven't even thought about asking before because you haven't been able to combine the data from the two systems. So let's talk about a few examples that we've implemented or we're currently implementing. So as SAP customers, I'm sure many of you perform some sort of annual inspections, like leak inspections or vegetation surveys against assets that are in SAP. So you perform that inspection in the field and you store the data in SAP. Integrating that with GIS makes it really easy to display all that inspection information on a dashboard or a map. Esri has their ops dashboard, and so you can build purpose-built products for the supervisors to see what inspections have been done, if they're ahead or behind, but also build more advanced metrics and executive level dashboards so that everyone understands where you are on the inspection program, on whatever that annual inspection program is, combining data from both platforms. And so Skip and I will talk a lot about how integration today, we'll talk a lot about how Esri and EAM or SAP Enterprise Asset Management is integrating, and that's really the common use case we see from our clients when they begin. They want to, they take their valve equipment in SAP and integrate it with the valve features in GIS. But as you start to think about the different use cases you could enable, realize that it's not just assets and equipment that we can geo-enable or integrate with. We can look at customer metering data, or we could look at how much money you're spending on repairing or replacing assets. So we can take financial data, customer data, really any data that you're storing in SAP, and combine it with Esri spatial tools to try to make sense of the data. So, and last, another area that a lot of my clients have been looking at recently, especially some of my California clients focused on the wildfires and also asset inspections, is what type of fault analysis or predictive maintenance could you do if you could combine your asset work and inspection data out of SAP with other data sources like real-time weather observations, or data from your SCADA systems, reading from SCADA. I know AI and predictive maintenance is something that's a popular concept right now, but to build a artificial intelligence or predictive maintenance program, you really do have to start with the building blocks. And having good data in both Esri and SAP and synchronizing that data together is one of those key first steps that will allow you to do predictive maintenance, fault analysis, all of those more advanced analysis tasks that I think we're all striving to move towards. So Skip, with that, I'll hand it off to you and have you talk a little bit about data integrity.
Yeah, that sounds good, Joe. I hope you can hear me okay.
Yep.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, depending on where you're located. And thank you, Joe. Yeah, Joe showed some really cool things in terms of the power of bringing this data from SAP and GIS together. But he did point out an important point, which is in order to make all this happen, right, you need to have data synchronization. That really forms the foundation for integrating your systems, bringing that data together. And the lack of proper synchronization can certainly impact your operations. It can either make or break those applications that you're putting together that consume that information. So I want to talk about those two things, and then also highlight a customer of ours, electric utility customer, that actually had the problem of these two different systems, bringing them together and finding out that there's all kinds of data discrepancies between them. And they were able to use data integration and synchronization to quantify some of those issues to drive business cases for cleanup. So data, a strong foundation is key to success, right? So just like building a house, if you were going to build a house or build a structure, you would give lots of consideration to the engineering of the foundation. You want to make sure you're using the best materials. You want to make sure that there's engineering behind it, because this is really going to hold up the rest of your structure. And cutting corners on your foundation is going to impact the rest of the structure, right? If your foundation cracks, that's going to affect how the door fits. It's going to affect how your windows fit. You may get drafts over the years. And ultimately, you could propose leaks or other structural damage, right? So just like building a foundation of a house, you want to think about how I'm going to build a foundation for my integration, right? So I have GIS, I have SAP, and I want to integrate these systems. But before I can do all of the great things that Joe had just mentioned, I need to think about how my data is going to integrate, how it's going to synchronize. So on the GIS side, you have feature classes, you have attributes, you have a data model. On the SAP side, you have something similar. You have your functional locations, your equipment record, an asset hierarchy. You may have characteristics about some of those assets and functional locations. So you want to make sure your data model is aligned. Your feature classes are linked to functional locations or equipment records. You want to make sure there's consistency and accuracy and completeness amongst your data. Once that's in place, then you can start to think about all of these great things that we can develop that really add value to our operations. I can start thinking about bringing this data together to support leak survey, to support hydrant inspections, to support job planning and scheduling and work and asset management. So all of these things, I think a lot of people put emphasis on some of these things early on, because this is really where you get the value in your operations and you return on investment. And they neglect to think about, okay, how do I have to get my foundation set so that I can take advantage of the data to support these things? A lot of people ask me, well, why do I need to have synchronization? Why can't I just link to my GIS from SAP or link to my SAP system from my GIS? And the answer is fairly simple, in that these are two separate enterprise systems that are put in place to support operations for separate purposes. And they both need to have that data within their database to support the native functionality of those applications. You spent lots of money and energy building your GIS system and converting your data and adding your attributes to your data model. The same on your SAP side, right? So you want to make sure that those environments are data rich to support the functionality of those tools. So take, for example, a billing meter. A billing meter has a location in GIS. It needs to connect to the rest of the infrastructure spatially. It connects to a service line. The service line may connect to a transformer, to a pole. And you need to have this connectivity so that you can do geospatial analysis and querying and map making. It might drive outage management. Well, that meter also has a spot in your inventory system. The meter might be in the warehouse, available to use in a house or a building. Once it's put into commission, the meter has to have a spot in your asset management system so that you can perform work orders and inspections and installs. And then while the meter is up and running in your house, you need to have a record for that in your customer information system so that you can perform, outage analysis, or if a customer calls in for an issue, you can actually get the attributes about that meter. And especially for billing, right? So you take your meter reads and you bill your customers for revenue, and that's driven from your customer information and billing system. So the lack of proper synchronization can certainly impact your organization, right? Your business practices and workflows. If the data is not accurate, decisions are going to be hard to make. Inaccurate reports and data modeling, inefficient operations and maintenance activities. So you're ultimately going to decrease the value of your systems if the data is not consistent and accurate between these two environments. So that brings me to a case study. We have a customer electric utility that actually built their GIS system and their EAM system. In this case, it's Maximo. But they built these systems separately, separate departments initiated the development of these systems, and they were used for separate purposes, right? But the thing is, both systems had common data. They both managed information about the poles, the transformers, the service lines, and so forth. And they were both mature systems, but because they were built over time by separate departments with separate processes, with no integration using dual data entry, there were a lot of discrepancies between these systems. If some equipment got changed out, perhaps they got updated in the EAM system and not the GIS. Or if a new subdivision came in, it was updated in the GIS system. But there may be a lag time before that information made it into the EAM system. So there's a real discrepancy, there's a real problem. And as technology advances, they wanted to bring this data together to support applications, and they found out that they really couldn't do that. It was really hard and difficult to do. So some of the issues that they came across were things like missing data. There may be data in the GIS system, like for example, the parcel number that was missing in the EAM system. In many cases, they had duplicates. They had discrepancies between their data. Maybe one system had a value that was different from another system because it was updated more recently, and so forth, and duplicate records. In some cases, there was duplicate features in the GIS, and it was hard to relate those to a single asset in the work management system. But the problem was they couldn't really get a good understanding of what the magnitude of this issue was and how to drive cleanup initiatives. So they actually used synchronization to quantify the problem that they had so they could drive a business case for funding to clean up the data and get the data organized appropriately to support all the wonderful applications they were looking to put in place. So they used our tool. We have a synchronization tool that allowed them to connect these systems together and then execute the synchronization. So in our tool, we extract the data, compare the data, look for discrepancies, and then in this case, they actually turned off their synchronization because they weren't interested in synchronizing. They were interested in really quantifying the synchronization or quantifying the discrepancies between the two systems. So we created a report, and in this case, we looked at transformers, poles, reclosers, and capacitors. And I have an example of just the report for the reclosers, but we have similar reports for the others as well. And it really kind of gives you an idea of the discrepancies across these systems. So in this case, almost 80% of the GIS features for reclosers are matched between the EAM system and the GIS system. Well, only about 55% of the recloser assets have a match with GIS. And so you can kind of see that the reason is that there's a lot of orphan records within the EAM system that need to be rectified. So this gives you a pretty good idea on the matches, but also the gap between the integration, right? And so they use that to drive funding, drive a business case, to put some power onto cleaning up this data. And then once the data is clean, then the synchronization kind of keeps that stuff synchronized going forward. So data synchronization is the foundation for integration that delivers the benefits. Once this data is synchronized, you're going to have more reliable data. Your users are going to adopt the system. They're not going to be frustrated by not getting the information that they need. How many of you have had users in your organization, and maybe it's even yourself, where you thought, geez, if I only had this data, I could do my job more efficiently? or I have this data, but it's wrong. I actually went on a work order. It told me this type of equipment. I went out to the job site, found out that the asset was totally different, and I had the wrong tools, the wrong parts. I had to go back to the warehouse and get new information, and I just wasted 2 hours of time, right? So being able to trust that data, be able to leverage those systems to what they're putting in place for is really important. And the last one here is higher return on investment, right? So you spend a lot of money on your GIS system, you spend a lot of money maintaining and bringing your SAP system on board. Bringing this data together to support operations is really important. And unless that data is going to provide what it needs to provide for those applications, you're really not getting the return on investment. So I think having this in place allows you to leverage the full capabilities of your technology investment moving forward. So with that, Lindsay, I'll turn it back to you. I think we have a polling question before the next session.
Great, thanks, Skip. So the second polling question is, when are you planning to integrate your ArcGIS and SAP environments? So I'll go ahead and open that up. And if you could just take a moment and submit your response.
I feel like we need hold music during this part. Maybe Skip can sing us a song.
I don't think you want me singing a song. This is a good chance for folks to put questions in the question and answer box as well, if you have questions that came up throughout the webinar that we can address.
All right, it looks like we've gotten most responses in, so I'll go ahead and close it.
Okay, I'll turn it over to Joe for the next section.
Perfect. Thanks, Skip. And so I think, Skip and I have both done a little bit to explain the benefits and the drivers for Esri SAP synchronization. And now we wanted to talk a little bit about what our approach is and kind of how would you go about starting a synchronization project or implementing synchronization. And then we'll talk a little bit about lessons learned there at the end. So Skip, if you want to go to the next slide. Myself and the Critigen team have been working in the Esri EAM or Esri SAP integration space for probably almost 15 years now. And it's been interesting to see how things have evolved over time. I honestly met Skip and his team in 2012. That was the first time we worked on a project together, and folks from his team and my team have worked together in different capacities since then. But really, synchronization in the beginning was, as Skip mentioned earlier, with one of his clients, someone doing dual entry or people doing dual entry into both Esri and SAP. It's over time evolved to people trading Excel documents and linking data together back and forth or processing changes via Excel. At Critigen, we have experience building custom sync solutions for some of our clients. We've also implemented kind of accelerators or solutions from other clients. And just in the past couple of years have started to work again closely with Skip and his team and really identify the benefits of a productized sync solution. With a productized solution, you're not worried about moving to the utility network or upgrading to S4. You're not worried that 6 months from now, after the integration project is done, knowing how you're going to add another equipment or change your GIS schema. So there's really a significant number of benefits of moving to a productized solution. And the industry has changed as both Esri and SAP have gone to a more services-based architecture and provided better interfaces and APIs. And so this is all kind of feeding on each other and developing into more robust synchronization tools. Another thing that we see, as I mentioned in 2012, Skip and his team was already working on a graphical user interface. So instead of having to go into code when you have a schema change or when you need to change the mapping between an Esri attribute and SAP attribute, it's now all user interface based. So it is really much easier for clients to own and maintain going forward. And then the last piece, kind of all of that together combines into a scenario where an integration project isn't something that's measured in months to years, and you geo enable every object in your two systems. You know, every equipment type in SAP gets mapped to something in Esri because this is the only time you're going to get to do it. This is really a much lower cost of implementation. It can be a shorter implementation. And so we're starting to see clients that just start with a single business process. So I only need synchronization right now because I want to do leak survey, or I only need synchronization for my valve inspection program. And you really can start with something as small as that and then grow the solution over time, which is, honestly way better than a large transformation project when you're trying to synchronize everything at once. So Skip, let's go to the next slide. And I'm sure, Skip, you and my team, myself, my team, we often get asked, how does a synchronization project actually start, and how does it work, and what makes it successful? And it's not really flashy, but successful integration starts with data alignment, and it starts with a business process focus. So rather than trying to synchronize everything in both of the systems, what are the specific use cases that you want to drive? Maybe you are just doing leak inspection. So let's look at the Esri and the SAP business process for leak inspection right now and understand what we need to synchronize between the two systems to make that better. It sounds strange, but there's been more than one time when I've actually introduced the Esri and the SAP people to each other at the start of one of these projects, because maybe GIS is a departmental organization and SAP is an IT organization, and they actually have never had to work together before. So understanding that business process and understanding exactly what objects you want to synchronize between Esri and SAP will allow you to start to do that analysis and the data remediation and the data cleanup that Skip talked about earlier. And in our mind, that really is what makes a successful project, is business process focus, data alignment. And once you do that, you can do all the fun stuff like the visualization and the analysis and all the things that I spoke about earlier. So Skip, I'll toss it over to you to talk a little, or actually, we have another slide to talk a little bit about lessons learned. So as I mentioned, start with a business process focus. Again, something I mentioned, only synchronize what you actually need. So that might be, I'm only going to synchronize valves or hydrants because that's all I need right now for my current business process. Similarly, most of the time, you don't need to synchronize all of the attributes on a hydrant to SAP. There might only be 2 or 3 that the SAP team is actually interested in, and vice versa. You don't need to synchronize everything from SAP to GIS. The more simple and the minimal number of elements you can synchronize is going to make your sync solution work way better, and it's going to make it much easier to maintain over time. Another concept we like to talk about a lot is what's your system of creation, where you actually create a new asset, and then what's your system of record, where you maintain it. In a perfect world, your system of creation would be the same, and you would only have one. So I get a new as-built in for a gas main, and I put that in GIS, and I add all the information I can, and then it gets synchronized to SAP. So GIS is my system of creation. Sometimes, though, you have a situation, let's say I have a client who was installing catch basins, and the day that catch basin went into the ground, it needed to be in SAP because an inspection clock started ticking. But they didn't get the as-built for that catch basin, sometimes for weeks to months. So they would actually create the catch basin equipment in SAP, and then at a later date, we built them a tool so they could attach the geometry once it actually got matched and link those two together. So, again, complexity is always, or reducing complexity is always the name of the game, but they're are some business processes that require a little bit more. So Skip, I don't know if you have any other, I guess, lessons learned or words of wisdom before we move on to the next slide.
I think that's an important point. Is the system of you always hear the term system of record. What is the system of record? And everyone kind of hones in on, oh, this is my system of record. It's SAP. That means everything has to be done in SAP. And I like the fact that you brought up system of creation. I kind of mentioned that a few years ago to a client and termed it system of data entry, right? System of entry. So I think the point is the same, that just because you're creating the data for the first time in maybe a mobile app because you did a collection and it comes into GIS and becomes a feature, and then it goes into SAP, just because it was created in GIS doesn't mean that it's not maintained in another system. So an example would be, I go out and do all my hydrant inspections, and I find a new hydrant that's not in my system. I enter it into my mobile app. That mobile app comes into my GIS system. It creates a feature. Then my synchronization engine takes over and it creates a functional location and equipment record in SAP. But then now that it's in SAP, it's there and I can maintain it, right? I can set up schedules to do inspections. I can do work orders on it and so forth, right? So it's not so much system of record anymore, but it's really kind of, this data is enterprise in nature and it's shared across the organization, and different systems need it for different purposes. And that's why, again, it goes back to the building that foundation of a very robust engineered synchronization capability to keep all this data aligned. But I always think of enterprise data as not really owned by any one system, but really shared across the enterprise to support native functionality of many different systems. And that's really what we're talking about in terms of having this foundation built.
Excellent. Yeah. I'll hand it off to you for the next slide.
Okay, I think we're going back to Lindsay for another polling question before the last section here.
Great, thanks. I'll go ahead and open it up here. How are you currently integrating your SAP and ArcGIS environments? We'll give everybody a minute. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll here. Thank you all for your responses.
Excellent. And I guess it is you.
Great. I think, yeah, I think it's me, Joe. Thanks. So section 3 is about using Sage and Geonexus integration platform. So Critigen and Geonexus are partners. We're bringing some technology together that really is complementary and can support organizations with enterprise, bringing enterprise data together for GIS and SAP. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Geonexus integration platform, and then Joe will come back in and talk about the Sage pattern for data visualization and analytics. So the benefits of the Geonexus integration platform for data synchronization. First off, I'll talk a little bit about what is the Geonexus integration platform, and then some of the benefits for data synchronization. So just a little bit about myself. I came out of Esri quite a long time ago, so I have a GIS background. Then I went into system integration consulting and helped organizations build enterprise GISs, integrate it with other systems like asset management, outage management, hydraulic modeling, and so forth. And through that, we built a lot of what I would call custom integrations, custom code to extract data and translate data and push it into another system. And we built event models so that we could detect changes from GIS and then take those changes and propagate them to other systems. And in doing that, we constantly had to be called back in whenever they upgraded their versions of GIS or the target system, whether it's EAM or so forth, to rebuild and test these integrations. And I started Geonexus technology with the idea in mind to remove the complexity and offer a fully supported off-the-shelf product that would allow users to simply configure these integrations and not worry about tightly coupled integrations, not worried about what happens when I upgrade my Maximo system or upgrade my SAP system, or I go to the next data model of Esri. I don't have to call back in my system integrator to rebuild those applications. I don't have to get my IT department involved. So it's a fully supported platform. And over the years, over the 10 years of our existence, we've kind of added on and elaborated it into a greater flexible platform for use. And so there's three primarily use cases that it supports. One is the data integration. So it has a robust synchronization engine within it that allows you to do a full compare of your data, detect all the changes and propagate those changes to keep those systems orchestrated properly. We do understand that there's a need in many cases. There's some use cases for near real-time data propagation. So for example, I create a work order in SAP and I want that work order to show up immediately in my web app, or I want that work order to show up immediately in my mobile app for my field crew to go execute. So we want to support APIs that allow you to build applications, whether it's in Web App Builder or ArcGIS Runtime, to be able to absorb that information in more of a real-time process to support events and workflows. And then all of this provides reports and data integrity analytics, right? So we want to be able to create data quality reports and understand discrepancies and take action on cleaning that data up. So we have robust reporting. And then all of this is built on what we call connectors, out-of-the-box prepackaged connectors to various systems. And this is a growing library. So the ones you see here are productized already. You can plug these in and you can get up and running very quickly. And it's fair to say that we are enhancing this library we're working on new things every day. And so you'll see more and more systems added to this mix. And one of the things I want to point out that we're working on in our roadmap is the build your own connector. And so this will allow system integrators or users even of the platform to create their own connectors to systems maybe that Geonexus isn't interested in productizing. Maybe it's a custom integration, maybe it's a custom application, a legacy application that you built that you want to connect to. We also have an RDBMS connector. So you may have a legacy application that doesn't have a fully defined API, or it's not service-based, but you still want to synchronize the data and perhaps connect straight to the database. So we'll allow you to do that. The platform is fully supported with over 50 licensed organizations across the globe. By far, most of them are in the United States and Canada, but we do have some customers in the UAE and Australia. And the synchronization is based on this full compare that guarantees proper synchronization. So in past experience, we've had to build integrations between GIS and other systems like SAP. And because we had to do that through enterprise service buses or message queues, and a lot of times those integrations were what I would call fragile, in that we lost data in many cases. A lot of times we had to use what we call version compare in GIS to actually understand what data has been added, updated, or deleted. And if you reconcile and post your data before you actually did a version compare, you lost that data. So there was a lot of fragileness. And so in building a product, we wanted to make sure that we addressed all of that and had that really robust foundation. So in doing that, we have our own full compare so that we can discover the changes. So we extract the data, we compare the values, we discover the changes or the differences, then we can apply some translation rules if necessary, and then propagate those data according to the rules. So on a field-by-field basis, I can determine if it's a one-way from SAP to GIS, or maybe for another field, it's from GIS to SAP. But there may be a handful of fields that I want to do bidirectional. Sometimes we update it in GIS and we want that to flow to SAP, but there may be another business process where we're updating that value in SAP and we want that to flow back to GIS. So supporting true bidirectional synchronization is important. And then we want to report all of the transactions through robust reporting. So this is an example of some of the reports that come out of the platform. We have PDF reports as well as XML reports. So the PDF report shows exactly what has happened during that transaction. We log all of the orphans, the duplicates, the discrepancies, We even log the updates and creates. We show the before value and the after value. So it's really robust. And some of our users have actually taken the XML portion of this and interrogated the XML and actually used some of the data to support some of the cleanup initiatives and activities. Remove complexity using plugin technology. So one of the things that we want to do here especially is remove the complexity. We want to make it super easy for you to integrate your systems together. And we built this platform based on what we call plugin technology. So we have these plugins between ArcGIS and SAP that provides the loosely coupled integration. You simply type in the credentials, the username and password, and you're connecting to these systems. And so what that's going to do is that's going to eliminate your version lock, and you're not going to have to go back and do costly rebuilds based on different versions that come along. So it really empowers the business, right, to make those connections and get the system configured. No code, low code. So we're seeing a trend in the industry right now of no code, low code. We're empowering the business units themselves to perform a lot of the configuration using platform technology, easy to use and configure using point and click, and then documenting the integration rules. We had one of our customers, City of Clearwater, actually had a custom integration that they managed and maintained for many, many years. It turns out that they had over 6,000 lines of code. And whenever the business units wanted to make a change, they wanted to add a new feature class to integrate. Maybe they changed the name of an attribute, or they added a new attribute that they want to start collecting. They had to put a request into the IT department to make those changes to the code. The IT department had to check out that code, make the changes, do the unit testing, and then test the integration in the development environment, and then propagate that to production. Well, that could take weeks or months to do, and it required a lot of time and resources from the IT department. Not to mention, when they upgraded their systems, the IT group had to go in and manage the code. Well, they determined that they weren't in the business of managing and maintaining software, so the City of Clearwater reached out and actually implemented the platform. And so now we've empowered the business units to self-serve and make the changes as they need to, right within the integration in the production environment. So if they simply want to add a new attribute to GIS and then carry that in their EAM system, they would just go into the user interface and add that new field and link it up to a field in the EAM system. So there was significant reduced reliance on the IT developers. And then there was no version lock, so they didn't have to go back in and rebuild code. It was very simple to test. And then they had detailed data integrity reports. So it's really important to understand that this shortens the time to value, right? So integration traditionally was a big cost. It took a long time, and you had to rely on very expensive and advanced IT resources and developers and system integrators. Well, now with a platform like this, it really shortens your time to value. You can install the application in minutes. You know, we can give you an installer. You can install it on a server in minutes. You can establish your connections, and you can start to configure the system. And basically, you're up and running in weeks, not months or years. And like Joe had mentioned earlier, it's scalable. So you can add a little bit of data now to support a use case, and then add more data later to support other use cases. You can even scale to connect to different business systems. So you might be integrating SAP and GIS today, but in the future, you might bring in a customer information system, or an outage management system, or a database that you want to pull this data into and keep it synchronized. You can start to use this system to go beyond just the two systems that you're integrating. So it's a real platform that scales with you over time. So with that, Joe, I think I'll turn it over to you, and you can talk about the SAGE pattern for data visualization and analytics.
Yeah, definitely, Skip. And before I jump into that, there was a question that came in, and it's whether an enterprise service bus is a best practice for this type of data synchronization. And I think you just spoke to some of that, but I wondered if you could talk a little bit about this approach and the ESB.
Yeah, so a lot of questions come up about that almost all the time from our customers. Why don't we just use our ESB that we have? And the answer is typically around a couple of different ways to answer that question. One is you still have complexity there. You're still an ESB, you're still building or coding your endpoints. You still have to code those connectors, if you will, to your GIS system using ArcObjects or going through the API of Esri. You're still building those connectors to SAP through the SAP API. So the service bus, ESB, is really just a transportation conduit of your information, of your message, and it handles that. But it's not an end-to-end solution, right? You're still coding, you're still developing your connectors, your endpoints. And probably the most important thing to understand, and this is the one that really gets everybody, is ESBs are great if you have a software product that is event-driven, meaning that when you create a transaction, an event fires and can put a message onto that bus to transport it. GIS, by the nature of what it is in terms of managing long transaction, is not event-driven. It's a long transaction, and you can't really get the events. There's no events to grab from GIS. And so when people learn about that, the light comes on and like, oh, okay, yep, we got to figure something else out. So we really tackled that problem with this. And Joe, if you remember way back when we were dealing with that gas utility in the Midwest, they were determined to use their ESB, but because of some of these limitations, right, decided to go with this platform. And so that was one of the key reasons was GIS is non-event driven that turned their decision towards something like this.
Excellent, thanks. And Chris, I hope that answered your question. If you have follow-up, feel free to drop them in the chat, or we'll have ways to communicate with us once we get done here. So I think to wrap up, I wanted to talk a little bit about Sage. And Sage is not a product, but it is a repeatable solution that Critigen has developed that uses our clients' existing investments in Esri and SAP to allow you to quickly add maps to SAP business processes and actually create SAP objects from an Esri map. And it also allows you to analyze SAP data using Esri tools. And so one of the keys to Sage that actually makes it work well and make it quick to implement is the HANA database and the fact that we're actually storing Esri data inside the Geo database in HANA. And it's important to point out that many of you haven't made the move to S4, SAP S4 or Suite on HANA, and you might still be using SAP ECC. We have customers that have done that, and they simply stand up a HANA database just for Sage, and quite often they find there are other analytical use cases that they can start moving that HANA to the HANA database. It does require GeoWorks Sync, Geonexus' sync platform, and that's one of the key reasons I wanted to talk about it today. It's actually something that Critigen has co-innovated with SAP and with Geonexus and Esri in SAP's co-innovation lab. So this started as an innovation idea that we worked on with a variety of partners, and we're now starting to roll it out to clients. The real benefit to Sage is that it is something that you could stand up in hours to days. And so the integration pattern is easy. You probably already have the rest of the components you need. So we could take a single business process like that hydrant status viewer that I showed you earlier today, and set that up in a very short period of time. And again, most people, when we think about synchronization, we think about equipment or assets, we think about EAM. But one of the benefits of doing this inside HANA and the HANA database is you can link to anything that you have in SAP or anything you're storing in HANA. So your IoT data or your SCADA readings, anything else that you have in HANA is available via Sage. So Skip, if you could move to the next slide. I can talk a little bit about some of the use cases that we've implemented to give you some ideas of how this would work. And really, this is kind of just tying up the benefits of synchronization and what you can do once you have it. I know many of you do some sort of outage management, and you need to notify people before an outage, and then maybe you need to go do relights if this is a gas utility. So you need to actually go and relight gas after an outage. Imagine if you could use an Esri web map and the trace tool, either in the UN or the geometric, can identify all of the customers that you need to relight. And then from the Esri web map, create a SAP notification for each of those customers and send them off to SAP and assign them and have them done all from the map. That's one of the benefits of Sage is we're actually performing SAP business processes or SAP enabled work in SAP. Another benefit of both integration and the HANA database is HANA's ability to quickly process large sums of data. So if you're not familiar with the HANA database, it's an in-memory database and it processes millions of rows. So attribute and spatial analysis run multiple times faster than they do in a standard DBMS. So I have a client right now who is trying to figure out how to deal with their hourly meter reads from 500,000 customers. And so one of the use cases for Sage is to put all of that data into the HANA database and then use Esri Insights, which is actually an analysis tool that was built for HANA, to look for patterns and do analysis on that data. So you can look for anomalies in meter reading data or your SCADA data and run both spatial and attribute queries that return results in milliseconds without a lot of fancy SQL work. Another example I talked about earlier is just this concept of ops dashboard and being able to build a web map where you view inspection results from your different inspection programs. But imagine if not only I can view my results, but I could see a missed inspection on my Esri web map. And right from the map, I can create a work order and dispatch it out into the field to go complete that inspection. So we're really reducing the number of systems that people need to swivel between to get their job done. So the last couple of things I've mentioned are all patterns on how you can use Esri's super robust tools on the web and the desktop to improve your SAP business processes. But also think of Esri and SAP integration combined with Sage and the ability to augment your SAP data by combining it with other data in GIS. So think about all the data you have stored in GIS. Then think about all the GIS data that you have via open source, like weather data or flood hazard zones. Think about data that you share or would like to share with your partners, like polygons that show where somebody's going to crack open the street to do some work. You can now combine all of that data together, either in a web or a desktop GIS tool, to drive fault analysis, hazard analysis, make better decisions, drive work more intelligently. So Sage really just becomes kind of the window into your integrated Esri SAP landscape. So I think, Skip mentioned this before, I'll mention it again. It's really the combination of GIS SAP synchronization using the Geonexus platform, and then Sage that allows you to do all those things. So with that, I think we'll move over to Q&A.
Great, thanks, Joe. So I know we just have a few minutes left here, so I will give a few of the questions and the rest we can follow up after the webinar. So one of the questions that came in was, how long does it take to implement? So I guess maybe Skip, do you want to answer that for GeoWorks first?
Yeah, I can answer that, and then Joe, you can chime in. So that's a big question, right? How long does it take to implement? And there's a lot that goes into that. If you came to me today and said that we had an existing integration and we just want to replace it with this platform, my answer would be, probably pretty quick, because we can take advantage of a lot of the work that's been done already in terms of your data mapping and your rules that you've already determined. If it's a brand new implementation where you don't have an integration, you have basically GIS and SAP, and you want to integrate them, then we would have to go through the exercise of understanding what the requirements are, like Joe had mentioned, what the business processes you want to enable, to determine what data needs to be integrated. And then once we get those figured out, then we can develop an integration specification and go through and actually do the mapping. So the easy part is the technology. We can install and configure it very quickly. It takes a little bit longer, I think, to think through the questions around your requirements and your business processes and really what data makes sense in what system and what are your practices for data maintenance. The larger question is, we can take, days or weeks to install and configure, but it could take, to go live, it could be a few months just because we have to go through the requirements up front. So Joe, do you have any more to add to that?
No, that's really it. I mean, it like you said, the technology is the easy part. The business process and potentially the data remediation and data alignment can sometimes take a lot longer.
Yeah, the data cleanup and data loading too. It just depends on the state of your data. How how much work we have to do on the data side of things to get this together. Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. We also had a question about migrating to SAP HANA, and they wondered why they would need integration if they moved to SAP HANA.
I'll let Joe answer this one. You're the expert at this one, Joe.
Yeah. So let's say you upgrade to S4 and you have HANA, and then you have your you move your geodatabase, all of your enterprise GIS data into the HANA geodatabase. Skip made a point earlier about how these are still two separate and complex software platforms with different rules about how you create and manage data. And so even though all of the data is in HANA, you still need some tool to synchronize the data between the systems. Unfortunately, having it all in HANA doesn't solve the problem. And it's funny because I actually gave a Sage demo with SAP and Esri in the spring, actually. I traveled for it, so it was quite a while ago now. And multiple customers in the room asked that same question, and both Esri and SAP said, these are still two independent systems with their own APIs and their own editing rules. And so we can't really combine the data anyway. You still need some sort of synchronization.
Joe, there is a question I want to kind of jump in here. Can you speak a little bit to the GEF? I think there is a question about if I have GEF, do I need this platform?
Yeah.
So do you want to shed a little light on what GEF is? Yeah.
That's a good point. We've actually been working with the GEF team. Critigen has, as part of this co-innovation in SAP's landscape. And I'll say two things about that. Number one, I think it's important to understand the difference between the part of GEF, which is a map that you put inside SAP, and the part of GEF which synchronizes data. The GEF map in SAP is actually a viable alternative to Sage. And what we find is some clients have use cases where they need to actually edit data, or they want to map within SAP's GUI. And in that case, GEF works really well. Some clients want to be able to take advantage of their Esri tools and an Esri web map based approach to managing business processes. And that's where you would use Sage. And obviously, a lot of our clients use both because they have different groups of users and different business processes. Sync for GEF, which is a synchronization solution that is part of GEF, but not part of the GEF product. It's actually a professional service that is implemented by SAP, is another option for synchronization. And we definitely have clients and have helped implemented GEF. I would say from a graphical user interface and a product standpoint, the Geonexus platform is a product. It's a supported sync product, whereas Sync for GEF is a solution that you pay SAP to implement, and it is not a supported product moving forward.
Great, thanks, Joe. I think we'll turn it back to Lindsay.
Great, thank you guys so much. And thanks everyone for your participation in today's webinar. We've run out of time, so we'll go ahead and follow up with the other folks that have asked some questions. But really want to thank Joe and Skip for joining us today and their great information. So if anybody has any remaining questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to Skip or Joe for more. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Everybody
thank
have
you
a
guys
great day.
yeah, thank you for joining. Our contact information is below, but thank you.
Thanks, folks. Have a good day.